Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm really excited about this conversation about housing in Dallas and in the country. So I wanted to start off with some kind of data on trends. Lisa, I know you produce an annual report on housing in Dallas and Texas. Can you tell us what you're seeing in terms of who can afford to live where and how that's changed over the last couple of years?
Sure. So, as many of you know, we had a housing crisis. So during that period of time, Dallas didn't really produce any housing in that period of time. And so now, a decade after, we're seeing a significant rise in multifamily housing. We're seeing a rise in single-family housing, but not necessarily in the city. In the northern suburbs, in Collin County is exploding, and the single-family housing that is kind of being built in Dallas is predominantly renovation-based, and our median household price has significantly jumped. A few years ago, you could probably buy a house in a median income family was more able to buy a house. Today, a median income family is not able to afford the current market house price for a house. And unfortunately, and it was just like one of the issues around what's available in the market, single-family housing is predominantly the only typology you can purchase in Dallas. So there isn't this variety of typologies that may be more affordable, and even townhomes, which are now starting to become a more popular product that is being built, are still very much in the $300,000, $400,000 range, $1,000. So we're seeing, while we still have very low-income communities in Dallas, the housing product that is being built is really only seeking to attract or hit the above probably 150% AMI block of people.
So it sounds like there's not a whole lot of affordability for people in the middle or lower income.
No.
Bryan, what do you think's causing this? Is it population crunch? Is it not enough building? What's going on here?
Sure. Well, let me just say at the outset, a lot of the data I'm going to sort of cite out here is coming from an upcoming report from the Manhattan Institute on Texas's affordability problems, and then also my own research that's going to be coming out in December in partnership with the Mercatus Center. And yeah, basically the fundamental issue is supply and demand. You have a bunch of people moving from other parts of the state of Texas, other parts of the country, even other parts of the world, coming really to the Texas Triangle, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, Houston, and in order to accommodate that growth, you need to produce more housing units. Supply needs to rise to meet demand to keep prices stable. But due to our zoning bias, really, as was stated correctly, we have a bias towards single-family homes. Due to that, we do not allow for the development or redevelopment and production of housing units that can accommodate that rise in demand. So really, we push development out towards the suburbs or the exurbs, and we're able to basically have a safety valve that can kind of accommodate this increase in demand by increasing supply in those areas. But we're kind of reaching, I think, the limits of that horizontal growth, and I think we're really going to have to look again at our zoning and other land use restrictions within the center cities, because we're seeing significant increases in price. In Dallas alone, the national median home sale price, I believe, is about $230,000. In 2016, for the first time in 20 years, Dallas exceeded that national average. 2 years later, it's now $11,500 over the national average. In Austin, it's a lot worse, as many of you Texans probably already know. It's $79,000 over the average. And that's significant because for every $1,000 increase in the final sales price of a home, about 150,000 households are priced out of the market. So that's kind of the scale of the problem we're looking at here.
When you say zoning restrictions, can you be a little more specific? What specifically is preventing more building from happening in areas where you think there should be more building?
Sure. There are a couple of different ways to look at zoning restrictions. One way is obviously to just look at the use that the zone is approved for, right? So we can only, in this part of the city, we can only allow for the construction of single-family homes. That means that a good chunk of the physical space of the city is basically devoted to only producing 1 unit per lot, which basically, obviously, very much constrains housing supply and its ability to meet demand. But there are other restrictions that are zoning-like or are zoning or including in zoning ordinances, like minimum lot size restrictions. So when you include that with a single-family residential sort of requirement, and you say that this house also has to be on 6,000 square feet, you're taking up even more space. And so in order to meet that demand, developers are going to sort of cater to more luxury style housing, people with more means, in order to make a profit.
So it's basically individual cities or regions saying there has to be a certain, houses or lots have to be a certain size, and that's causing a lot of the problem because a lot of bigger houses are being built. That's
right, and also sometimes outright prohibitions on the construction of things like apartments, where lower-income people were usually able to get their housing units. The Manhattan Institute, I referenced their report that's going to be coming out soon, and they did a survey of 90 cities in the North Texas region, and they found that of those 90 cities, only 2, Dallas and Arlington, I believe, allowed for the construction of apartments in over 5% of their land area. I mean, that kind of shows you why we have the affordability crisis that we do.
So Lisa, what can government do about this? If you're taking the kind of policy approach, what's a solution here?
So I think we do need to relook at our zoning. I think that is fundamental, and it's not just about building apartments. Like, let me be clear about that. If you actually look at a lot of older parts of Texas cities, you saw a lot of 4, 3, 8plexes, which are quaint in comparison to the 350 unit apartments that are being built today, and actually allow for a much wider diversity of income ranges. And so when we talk about wanting to have mixed income communities, things like that, having single family housing next to a 4plex actually potentially allows you to do that. And then actually, if we go one step further and encouraging developers to build those for sale, we've been hearing from developers that there are liability issues related to condo sales, and that's the reason why they don't build them. We're still trying to figure out what that means on our side. So that's one piece, right? So that's the actual production piece. The second piece is I think we need to look at how do you allow for long-term affordability. So I think oftentimes in the past we thought about affordability in 2 ways. Either it was we built subsidized multifamily housing to kind of like house poor people, or we did homeowner assistance so that this individual homeowner could afford home ownership. But the problem with at least that latter piece is that you didn't get to maintain a sense of affordability within that community past that one homeover. The city invested money and then lost it. So tools like land trusts and other kind of tools that would potentially allow for long-term affordability and long-term affordability across a city. So at least in Dallas, as if you've been following the Supreme Court, we have a history and are still promoting affordable and low-income housing in certain areas of our city, and are not producing or promoting affordability in other parts of our city, and that is a fair housing issue. So, one of the things I'm interested in paying attention to or following is Houston is doing a citywide land trust, which potentially could allow for land trust lots across the city in all its different types of neighborhoods and allow for long-term affordability.
What about from a private perspective, Bryan? Obviously developers have to get around the zoning restrictions somehow, but is there a way to incentivize them to try to get on board, to advocate for denser housing or build denser housing?
I think unless you tackle the underlying zoning and local land use restriction issue, you can provide all kinds of incentives to developers, but they're going to go where the market is going to give them a profit. So I really think that revisiting the land use restrictions is kind of the fundamental piece of it. And there are a variety of ways to do that. I think one thing that city policymakers should keep in mind or bear in mind is that is the history of these land use restrictions and why they came into play in the first place. Cities have a valid role to play in advancing public health and safety, and that's oftentimes what is cited in support of their zoning ordinances. But when you look at the history of the court cases and the city minutes behind many zoning ordinances across the country, including in Texas, these land use restrictions and zoning ordinances were put into place to keep certain kinds of people out. Certain kinds of people of color, people of low means. And I think that is why we have inherited this bias towards single-family housing throughout the Texas Triangle. And so I don't believe city officials are animated by that kind of darkness anymore, but they are inheritors of that system, of that legacy. And so I think that makes it even more incumbent upon us to make the market work for everyone. By revisiting those zoning ordinances and land use restrictions.
You know, it's interesting. It seems like a lot of this comes down to political will. I live in San Francisco, and I don't know how many of you have heard about this, but there's this movement called the YIMBY movement, Yes in My Backyard, and it's people kind of advocating for denser housing. And then, you know, to contrast with the NIMBY movement. And I think one of the problems here is that if you're a homeowner, you have some incentive for there not to be a lot of dense housing built or more housing built because your house is going to keep going up in value. So, Lisa, how do you think you can change political will to get more people on the side of the YIMBYs?
I think education is paramount to that. I think, and unfortunately, you know, people are actually more interested in the conversation of housing and affordable housing because it's starting to affect them. As more middle income or what people, you know, consider themselves like comfortable Americans are starting to face challenges of affording and sustaining housing. They're now more interested in the policies that shape housing. So that's part of it. I think another piece is, you know, it's moral arguments are always hard because, you know, your morals are different than my morals, but when we talk about wanting diverse neighborhoods and people say, I want a diverse neighborhood, I think attaching a policy to that and saying, well, if you really want that, these are the policies that would help promote that. And we were talking a little bit backstage about accessory dwelling units, and there was a big, you know, recently there was a kind of not a fight, but there was a advocacy to get accessory dwelling units to be adopted in Dallas by right. We didn't quite get that far. Now neighborhoods can say, yes, I want accessory dwelling units in my neighborhood by right, but it's still kind of an opt-in piece. So it actually requires there to be that yes in my backyard and one extra step of advocacy.
Bryan, I want to throw that question to you too, because I know you come from more of a kind of a free market perspective. For people coming from that perspective, how do you get people to really advocate for and get on the side of building denser housing?
I think it's a really tough issue because people are really sensitive about their housing, because if you look at the average American, most of their wealth is tied up in their housing. And so they're very sensitive to any changes to their neighborhood that they feel like could affect their property value. I think from a policy perspective, I've really been attracted to an idea from David Schleicher out of the Cato Institute, I think previously with Yale. And he's written a really great paper called The Zoning Budget, where he advocates that cities take a different tack to zoning, where they basically outline over the course of 10 years or a certain time period how much housing production we want to see to meet projected demand in our city. And therefore, they kind of have locked in that they know they're going to be producing X number of units over this course of time. And so that kind of just changes the dynamics, because you're always going to get, I believe, neighborhood opposition to upzoning. You need to find a way to sort of change the dynamics of the negotiations when you're sort of reconsidering these questions. And I think that's the kind of policy solutions that we need to think about. How do we change the dynamics of the negotiation with the neighborhood groups so that we are able to increase our production of housing?
So Lisa, have you seen any innovative communities in Texas or nationwide solve this problem, or start to figure out how to solve it?
No. But this is not a new, to me, this housing is similar to like education policy. If you look at art history of it, we've always been like talking about it and complaining about it because it's always been a problem. I think there are glimmers of or good practices. I think that they always can be made better. I think the challenge ultimately is I think what you touched on is like our sense of who we are and our family and our safety and our health is tied up in our housing. And so there's a huge fear of changing that. And there's also we've promoted, not just in housing, but in general, like a fear of the other. And that tends to be, unfortunately, associated with people that don't look like me or people that are of lesser means than me. Or even sometimes, I was talking to a housing placement individual that was saying that their low-income residents that were looking to move to the suburbs were a little bit nervous about living with so many white people. So I think that kind of fear crosses all lines. But the way that we could actually overcome that fear potentially is by pushing ourselves to live in more mixed communities. But right now our system, both from a financial, we haven't touched on property values. Property values are a huge piece of why we get the production that we get and the homogeny of what we get in neighborhoods. So our current system pushes for neighborhoods to not be diverse and have a range of income levels. And so until we change that system, maybe small piece by small piece, we're gonna continue to get the same outcome.
And how would you change
this? Yeah, that was the point. I don't have a solution for the property housing value issue, but I know that it's a huge piece of using comps to get financing is a huge issue in regards to building new housing. So I work for a architecture and planning firm, and we build or help developers build housing. And I know in Dallas in particular, comps have prevented us from building potentially, a smaller house in a neighborhood or a slightly larger house in a neighborhood because of the financing piece. Because the financing piece wants you to build exactly what's already there. And so that's beyond zoning, that's the financing piece. I think the banks have a huge role to play in this. And then I think innovate things like, I think we're gonna have to look at more cooperative models. And so this takes a little bit out of government, but it's still a cooperative dynamic that helps to share resources, whether that be land, financing, space, that sort of thing. Shared housing as our population gets older. I think we're just gonna have to look at different models of housing.
Well, so you touched a little bit on housing finance, and we've seen on the national level some changes to the mortgage interest deduction. Bryan, I'm wondering if you think there are any federal policies that could help create more, create incentives to build more housing or make it easier for certain people to buy housing in different neighborhoods.
Yeah, so full disclosure, I come from more free market, libertarian think tank, so we're typically more skeptical of federal involvement. But to the extent that we can look at HUD policies, as I believe Ben Carson expressed some openness to looking at conditional giving of grants on cities revisiting their zoning codes, I think that's a good step. I think that's definitely a good step.
And I can't let you go, Lisa, without asking you just for a quick assessment of Dallas's comprehensive housing plan. Is it gonna help create more affordable and moderate price housing here?
I think it is a wonderful first step. For those of you who haven't been following Dallas's housing production or housing department for the last couple of years, we've had some issues. So I'm excited that there's now a policy at all. There hasn't been standards around our housing production ever. So this is a good first step. I still am very concerned that it's still very much in that framework of multifamily, single family. There is not a conversation around, or there are not incentives around different typologies of that housing, getting home ownership in anything other than single family housing. There's some design requirements, which I think is a good thing, because unfortunately, when you build affordable single-family housing that looks like affordable single-family housing, you're really just creating the next low-income neighborhood of tomorrow. And so design plays a critical role in this, but I think we need to be a little bit more nuanced within the policy, but I think my hope is that will continue to evolve as the policy evolves. And the policy was really just the beginning. There are a whole list of other things that the city needs to potentially adopt or look at in conjunction with that. So things like, I'm gonna butcher this because I butcher it every single time, homestead overlay, every single time. Basically, it allows for overlays around property taxes for existing communities as new development comes in to help prevent displacement. So Dallas needs to potentially adopt those overlays for neighborhoods that are, right now are getting a lot of attention for new development, so that their existing communities will not see the stark spikes in their property taxes and then potentially have to, be displaced because of that new development and, investment.
Thank you for wading through that.
Sorry.
I want to turn to the audience for questions. So please raise your hand if you have a question, and for either of our panelists. Okay, see a question up here.
I'm Covington with Covington's Consulting and Services, and I'm here as an advocate for HUD housing. In talking and listening to Dr. Carson and the Assistant Secretary, Anna, Section 3 residents have to be hired by construction companies and general contractors when they're rebuilding or renovating multifamily housing with HUD dollars. So how is it, what are you doing for multifamily housing building, so that when they do acquire a job that allows them to pay full rent somewhere in a better neighborhood, making it affordable and available to them?
So if I understand the question, it's how do you ensure that there are still tenants for the multifamily housing? Okay, does either of you have a answer for that question?
Well, to be honest, I'm not familiar with the specifics of the program, but there's obviously a role for support for housing for low-income folks as they're trying to get into the market. But in order for that to be a support that leads into integration into the normal market, there needs to be, again, a wide variety of housing models at a wide variety of price points. And right now, our single-family zoning biased system kind of prevents people from being able to afford real housing once they move out of income-supported housing. And that's basically my larger take on the issue. And so unless you allow for things like the by-right construction of duplexes or threeplexes or fourplexes, like they're allowing in Minneapolis, where extended family can live together, or one family can live in a unit and rent out the other 3 units in order to afford to be able to live in the city. Until that kind of stuff starts being able to happen, it's just going to continue to be a problem.
So it sounds like again and again, what we're really coming to is we need to kind of step out of the old model of single family versus big apartment buildings and think of a whole range of different things to build.
And I do want to add one other piece. We also have an issue in regards to income discrimination or source of income discrimination. So as families move out of HUD developments and into maybe a voucher program, apartments aren't, at least in Texas, aren't required to allow them. They can say no, even though they can pay the rent, but because that source of income is coming from a voucher, they can say no. And this is contributing not only to the inability of low-income families to be able to access better sources of better locations closer to jobs and schools and all these other things that would potentially allow for that next generation to not need support. It's also contributing to, you know, to fair housing issues of, you know, concentrating our low-income communities of color in certain geographies, particularly in our metroplex.
And if I understand correctly, some states or cities have passed laws to prohibit source of income discrimination, but I believe there are no Texas cities among those. Is that correct?
I think Austin at least did or tried with a little bit of pushback from the state.
Got it. Great. Well, we could keep going all day, but unfortunately we can't. But I want to thank both of our panelists for this really informative discussion. Thank you so much.